So I don't know if you're anything like me, but I went into education wide-eyed, naive, thinking that I was fully prepared. I was an individual that knew from the very beginning that I wanted to teach. It was in my DNA. I had a teacher bedroom. I had a chalkboard and an overhead projector, and I just knew that teaching is what I wanted to do. And I very quickly learned that teaching is one of the biggest bait and switch cons out there. I don't know if you can relate to this, but when you declare a teaching major and then you're bombarded with all this propaganda of like pictures of classrooms with kids raising their hands and kids moving from center to center, and it looks like they're completely organized and quiet and getting along with each other and keeping their hands to themselves. And then you do student teaching second semester with a master teacher who has already set up the classroom, and you get to do these fantastic lesson plans and have all these great adventures as an educator, and then you walk into your own classroom. Now, my first classroom as a middle school teacher, I had 13 boys. I was pretty excited about this at the beginning because I really thought that that's what I wanted to do, was to teach boys. And so entering into that first year and seeing that I was going to have 13 boys in my advisory group, and those were the kiddos that I was going to spend the most time with, and I thought, this is fantastic. This was built exactly for me. And then I get into that classroom and very quickly realized that I didn't get one of those classrooms like my student teaching classroom was. It wasn't that organized, and kids didn't move around the room quietly with their hands to themselves, and I had no tools in how to establish any sort of classroom management. As a matter of fact, the only thing that I was taught was really to let the kids make the rules, so that we all come together as a community, kind of like a tribe. And so let the kids make those rules. And let me just tell you, that doesn't work out. It doesn't work out so well, because that's what I tried. And so about 3 weeks in, I can remember I had some pretty difficult kiddos that year, and one day I decided, I just really want them to be more engaged, and so I decided I'm going to let them start reading aloud. I've been having them come in after lunch and read aloud. I was reading aloud to them, and that had worked pretty well, and so I thought, just to get them more involved in the process, I would have them read along with me and ask them to read. And so I called on this young man, his name was Scott, and I said, Scott, why don't you go ahead and pick up from there, and you read a couple paragraphs and then popcorn that on to someone else. And he looks up at me and says, F you. And I think, oh my goodness, what do I do now? So I go back to that filing cabinet in my brain of teacher preparation, and I think, okay, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? And the first thing was, don't let them see you sweat. Stay neutral. Well, I'd already lost there because I did this big when he said F you, and so I'd already failed on that. And then the next thing was give them choices. Well, in the moment, I was frantic and I couldn't think of any choices whatsoever. And so we got into this cycle very quickly of Scott would say F you, and I'd say see you, and he'd say F you, and I'd say see you. And the whole year kind of went that way from about 3 weeks on, of Scott and I staying in this conflict of this cycle of conflict. I also, this was during the time where you would have kids, the school nurse would come into my room right before lunch and give the kids that needed the medication, kids that were on meds, she'd dole out their medication. And I can remember thinking, why are they medicating the kids? Maybe they should medicate me, because maybe if I could stay a little calmer, the day would go a little bit smoother. And, honestly, I learned later that there was some truth to that. Now, not the medication part, like not taking the meds. That was not the answer for me. But there was an answer in that if I was able to stay calm, I was able to create calm. Because just as chaos is contagious and conflict is contagious, calm is contagious too. So my second year of teaching, I was introduced to some strategies really to be more effective in those moments when kids were in conflict, and I could learn how to stay calm. So today we're going to talk about some of those strategies and understanding how trauma really can impact students' behaviors, and how when we have more strategies around social emotional learning and ways to address those behaviors more proactively and preventively, that we can stay calm in those times of high stress and conflict. So my name's Steph Jensen, and my journey into the education world started as a middle school teacher. I then became a reading specialist and did some work with Boys Town. I was introduced to their education model my second year of teaching, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, some of those strategies. I went from there to actually work with Boys Town. Been with Boys Town for 17 years. I am a licensed professional counselor and have the privilege to work with educators all over the United States and help them to identify some of these strategies, and really, I say, give us our passion back for teaching. I think so often we feel powerless, especially when it comes to behavior and the extreme things that our kids are dealing with today. And I really find great joy in being able to introduce people to these strategies that truly give us our power back and our passion back for teaching. With me today is Susan Lamke, and I'll let Susan introduce herself before we continue.
Thanks, Steph. My name is Susan Lamke, and I started working at Boys Town in 1990, working with children in out-of-home placement, so kids that had been removed from their homes and kicked out of school. Worked with adolescents using our teaching model. And then I went into education and as a classroom teacher. And what I saw across both environments are children struggling with their social emotional learning, with mental health issues, and learned through my work at both Boys Town and in school that a lot of their behaviors originated with trauma experiences they'd experienced in their community, in their homes sometimes, and even at school. And so the Boys Town model really allows us to use some strategies to create predictable and calm environments, like Steph mentioned, to diffuse some of those triggers that cause some of those challenging behaviors in the classroom.
All right, so let's look at everything. We have so much on our plates as educators, and I completely understand that. And we start to talk about, first of all, we have our academics, we have our state standards, we have state testing, we have our curriculum, we have checklists that we need to get through, so much that we need to cover that can become overwhelming. And then we have, on top of that, we hear more and more about social emotional learning, and we think, my goodness, what is this, and how do we make this work? And how do I have time to integrate this social emotional learning into the academics that I'm already trying to cover? And then we have our PBIS, and we might have other initiatives like being trauma sensitive and multi-tiered systems and restorative practices, and the list just goes on and on and on. And we try and step back and figure out, how do we balance this? Because no one can take care of everything that's on that plate, right? Like, none of us are going to be able to eat all those portions. And so how do we do some portion control? And with that, I think, is just starting to understand how many of these initiatives really do support one another, and not be looking at them as separate initiatives, but just pieces of a whole, very similar to our academics. So just like we do a nice job of articulating our academic goals from like that highest level, and then we dig down into what are the specific things that we're going to teach. When we look at being trauma sensitive, when we look at social emotional learning, we look at PBIS and multi-tiered, even restorative practices, there are some common threads amongst all of those that I think really helps. Once we understand the common threads amongst those big initiatives, it starts to make it much more manageable. And so we're going to look today at really how to manage those portions, how to integrate those strategies around social emotional learning that are going to address some of those trauma responses and just some of those normal, irrational, impulsive behaviors that we see with kids alongside the academics that we're already covering. So as we look at moving forward, we really just want to provide, first of all, just an understanding, a foundational understanding around trauma sensitive practices. I think we hear that term a lot, but what does that really mean? So we're going to break that down today. We'll look at some of those core contributors to trauma. What are some of those experiences? What are some of those things that are occurring that might be increasing some of those trauma behaviors or those stress responses that we're observing in our classrooms, which will lead then to the cortisol effect. Cortisol plays a big role in these behaviors, and really is kind of that hormone that either can help us to create calm or chaos. And so we'll look at that. And then also look at just what are some practical strategies. We're going to talk a lot about the philosophy, but how can we move from the philosophical to the practical? So we don't want to spend a whole lot of time with the philosophy. We want to give you some strategies. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Susan. We're going to look at defining trauma.
I think first and foremost, it's important to remember that trauma is just anything that a child might have experienced, but whether it's trauma or not is really defined by the individual person. There are all kinds of types of trauma, and I'm sure you've heard about many of those. Common neglect, physical and sexual abuse, witness to violence, those kinds of things. But there's trauma in our environment all over the place. Social media, if kids are listening to negative messaging all day long, all evening, for long periods of time, very frequently. Natural disasters, things that are going on in our world and not just in their community and their neighborhood, they could perceive as traumatic. And what one person goes through, Steph and I could have the same experience, and I might perceive it as traumatic and she doesn't. And so that's why it's really important to remember that maybe the kids in your classroom were all exposed to the same thing, but some were perceiving that as traumatic where others were not. And so we really need to be mindful of that, and so we can't make judgments with kids. For example, I was working with 2 twin girls, and they had just recently lost their grandfather to cancer. And one was fine. She kind of understood, or appeared fine. She understood that he had cancer, he was sick, and that he had passed away and gone to heaven. And so she could communicate with him, just through prayer, and knowing that she could, in her good night prayers, she could just talk to her grandfather. And so she seemed to have a good understanding. And while both girls had seen their grandfather in the hospital and was sick and had the same conversations, the sister was very preoccupied with the fact that her grandfather had passed away with cancer. And so she started asking questions like, do only people with white hair get cancer? Can children get cancer? My teacher said she was sick. Does that mean she has cancer? Nightmares started to increase. Behaviors started to occur in the classroom that were unusual, off task, walking around, not paying attention, and even escalated into just arguing and being sent out of the classroom sometimes. And so while both girls had the same experience and they were very close in age, they perceived that situation very differently. And then those behaviors roll out into the classroom and into those other environments. So as you think about the students that you're working with, it's important to remember that childhood trauma impacts many, many children. Oftentimes 1 in 4, 1 in 5 students in your classroom, according to the research, has been through a traumatic experience. So in an average sized classroom, that's about 5 to 7 children. If you're working in a school in a high need area where there's high poverty, high violence, those types of things, you might have 100% of the students in your classroom who have experienced some type of trauma. And that's going to definitely come out in their behaviors. Their traumatic responses we perceive as just challenging behaviors, and so it's really important that we understand where those are coming from and have calm, predictable ways to deal with those. All kinds of things that occur in school throughout a normal day can trigger those traumatic responses. It's that muscle memory. So they might hear a loud noise, a fire truck might go screaming down the street. Somebody might touch them or bump into them. It might be a specific space or place, a hallway, the playground, a restroom, that can trigger some of those responses, and they just start to go into that fight, flight, or freeze mode, and they don't even have a thorough understanding of why. So when we see behaviors like Steph experienced when she asked Scott to read aloud and he said F you, something else may have been occurring, or there was something along those lines that triggered that with that young person. So not to take those behaviors personally, but to understand that they're coming from a space and place of possibly a traumatic experience.
Yeah, and I heard someone say, and this has really stuck with me, I heard it in some session or some training around trauma that these responses are normal responses to abnormal experiences. And that really helped me kind of put that into perspective. I liked that, and that really has stuck with me, understanding that this is their normal response because of abnormal experience. They don't know how to do it differently. And so especially in our classrooms, we have to be mindful of helping them to learn alternate ways to respond to those triggers, because we can't take the triggers away, but we can start to help to shape new and different behaviors or responses. Great. And that kind of leads to just the physiological effects of trauma. And we're learning more and more. And if you haven't signed up, or if you're not familiar with the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, it's a great resource as we're looking at looking for ways to help traumatized children learn. As a matter of fact, they have a resource out there that is titled that, Helping Traumatized Children Learn, that gives you some strategies and just more information if you're looking for some deeper knowledge around trauma and its effects in the classroom. And what we're finding is that when we look specifically at cortisol, and cortisol is your stress hormone, a little bit of cortisol is good. We need cortisol throughout the day to help us stay focused, to keep us energized, to keep us motivated, for us to remember what we're going to do next, remember what we're going to say next. We need small doses of that cortisol throughout the day. So you might think about it. Yesterday, I was getting some things together, and I couldn't find my watch. I couldn't find it anywhere. And so, you know that feeling where when you can't find something and you get this kind of this anxious energy, almost like this buzz, and then you are just on a mission. Like, you can't do anything else until you find that thing that is lost, and it just kind of consumes. That's cortisol. Another example of cortisol is if you wake up in the morning and you think, well, I can snooze for a minute. And so you hit your snooze and you fall back into what feels like a really deep sleep. And then you wake up out of that, and you wake up out of it and you're like, oh my goodness. And you think, I must have slept through that alarm. I must have overslept, because you felt like you had a really good sleep. And then you look and you had 2 minutes left on your snooze. But there's no way you're going back to sleep now, because you have this energy, this anxious energy. That's that cortisol. Helps you get up out of bed in the morning. So small amounts of cortisol throughout the day are necessary and needed for us to stay focused. Now, the one thing that we're learning is that you need some space between the cortisol. So, I mean, you need some space between those stressful events. On average, to maintain baseline cortisol, you need anywhere between 20 to 45 minutes between stressful events. So think about that, but from one stressful event to the next, you really want to look for at least some downtime of 20 to 45 minutes for that cortisol to be reabsorbed into the bloodstream to a baseline level. It helps you kind of maintain that calm, so that you're not in that crisis mode. Well, what we're learning about individuals that are living in high stress or experience trauma is they have what's being referred to as a leaky faucet of cortisol. So they're getting kind of this constant drip, drip, drip of cortisol, which makes it very difficult for them to maintain any sort of baseline of calm, which puts them at very high risk for what's being called a cortisol waterfall. So just a complete overwhelming amount of cortisol, which might look something like you may be just giving a lesson in your classroom, and you might be walking around, you might be a little animated, you might tend to use your arms, throw your arms around, kind of like I do once in a while when I'm presenting, and you might just bump into someone and they're like, yo, bubble, get out of my bubble, and get really upset about that. That's a cortisol waterfall. That might be a young person who is hypersensitive to touch or proximity. And so now I just broke that bubble, unknowingly setting off that cortisol waterfall. And so we need to be aware of just those physiological effects of cortisol and how that may be impacting those intense behaviors where kids go kind of from 0 to 100 in just a snap. That may be due to those higher levels of cortisol, that hypersensitivity to any sort of real or perceived threat. So we can expect some of those, which then makes it very difficult for kids to come to a place of calm. So anytime there's any level of stress, they're getting a higher dosage because they already have that drip, drip, drip of cortisol. So any sort of stressful event puts them over the edge so that they're really going into that intense fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so the more that we can be predictable, the better we're going to be at helping them to manage that cortisol and manage those behaviors. And so when I go back to that example with Scott and we look at the conflict cycle from Dr. Nicholas Long, and I really like this image of how this cycle happens, because we have kiddos that are coming into us that have experienced stressful events. We don't know what it is. And again, like Susan said, we can predict we're going to have 5 to 7 kids in our classroom that are going to be at some level of a stressful event. They're already in the stressful incident that has started to shape their feelings and their beliefs towards others, their feelings about themselves, their beliefs around others, which then we may say something like, why don't you go ahead and pick up and read right there, Scott? And then all I see is that observable behavior. All I see is the F you. And if I don't understand that my response in that moment is either going to reinforce that negative self-image, that negative feeling about self and others, I am either going to reinforce that, or I am going to start to shape that into a more pro-social, a more positive feeling or belief about themselves. My response in that moment, so we get to that adult or that peer reaction in that moment, is either going to serve to help that child to be successful or to self-destruct. So what is my behavior in that minute? And I think that that's where we go to really understanding the impacts of trauma, because those behaviors are going to be much more likely to escalate more quickly. Which means we then, oftentimes as adults, when we don't understand where these behaviors are coming from, we oftentimes become much more reactive and punitive. Keep in mind also that when they're in this cortisol waterfall, there is no rational thinking. Now, we can't depend on kiddos to have rational thinking anyway, right? Because that part of the brain is not fully connected, that prefrontal cortex, not fully connected until what we're looking at now between ages 21 and 26. So unless you have 21-year-olds sitting in your classroom, we can't expect rational thinking all the time. But even more so when you're in when your brain's been hijacked by cortisol, there is no rational thought. And so when we as adults go immediately to consequences or rational questioning, our kiddos just melt down even more. It just causes more cortisol, more stress, which causes greater escalation, which then leads to more time out of the classroom. The whole FU-CU goes back to that, more time out of the classroom, which then leads to decreased test scores. Less time in the classroom, less academic information leads to, obviously is going to correlate to lower test scores and lower academic success, which then oftentimes then can end up with suspensions and expulsions, which overall creates that negative school culture. So I think as we step back and first understand that a lot of these behaviors are coming from a place of stress or trauma, and then can be escalated by our behaviors, what can we do to start managing ourselves so that we can check ourselves before we wreck our kids? And we know that the one thing that can mitigate the effects of cortisol is a structured, predictable environment. So what are we doing practically to create that structured, predictable environment so that we can start to lessen the effects of the cortisol? How are we creating a culture of learning, a culture of calm?
I think the first place that we start with is just as working with young children or young people, is just to change the lens from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you and how can I help. And so not taking those behaviors personally and just understanding that nothing is wrong with that child, but something has happened to create those responses. And so we have to find a way to help. And like Steph said, creating that structured and predictable environment is the first place that we need to start with. So we know that most trauma-sensitive models, they align with social-emotional learning, they align with our Boys Town education model, and there's some certain conceptual things. So thing one is to change that lens to what has happened to you and how can I help. Then we want to move into creating an environment where we just convey complete understanding that behavior is just communication. And it's our job as the adult, we have that professional responsibility to manage that situation. And so having our own self-control strategy, having our own safe plan, and then being able to teach and communicate those things to kids is really going to help to create that safe and predictable environment. So having those self-control strategies for ourselves as well as for our students, so we understand that these things are going to happen. We know that we need to put some structures in place to help everybody manage their self-control, and we do that by teaching skills. We do that by building on skills. And so we actively have to teach those things, because the challenging behaviors that we're seeing, the behaviors that Steph was talking about, are the skills they have right now. And so we need to replace those with more appropriate pro-social skills so that kids stay in that classroom. And we want to have that future focus. How can you be successful here with me? How can you be successful in your neighborhood and beyond? So we want to go beyond just our space and place, but that's a great way to start. So we always want to take a look at our students' strengths and what they come to us with and what we can build on. Because then we can start to get some small wins. We can start to teach some skills based on their strengths and have them to start seeing that they can advocate for themselves, they're empowered to make choices, and that they can control themselves. So we're going to talk about some strategies that just create that safer environment. Teaching advocacy skills like how to ask for help, how to disagree appropriately, how to stay in control of your own emotions, how to keep yourself calm, and regulate some of those fight, flight, or freeze responses that you're experiencing. We want to really give kids that empowerment of, I am in control of me and I can make good choices. They've been through a lot, and we need to help them to see those things so that they can then again focus on that academic learning. And a lot of it just begins with creating positive and healthy relationships. So really, again, looking through that lens of what has happened to you, what structures can we put in place, your rules, your procedures, your skills, all those things create predictability for kids, and they create that safe environment. Even if they have to do things throughout the day they don't necessarily like, if they know it's just part of each and every day, they know it's coming, they know that's what's expected, and they can learn to do those things, because we want to teach those skills that help them to navigate their way through their day. So we want to give kids those skills so that they have some control over what's going on instead of us trying to control and overpower them, because then we just get pushed back. So with our Boys Town education model, we do align very nicely with trauma-sensitive schools, with social-emotional learning, with those two foundational pieces of just teaching skills and building those relationships. So again, teaching those skills that are going to help kids to express their feelings, advocate for themselves, identify when those triggers go on. How do I feel? Is my heart beating quickly? Am I feeling angry? Am I starting to sweat? And when I feel that way, that's when I can kick in one of those stay calm strategies or self-control strategies. This is the time I need to take a deep breath. I maybe need to ask for help, that I need to take some time for myself, to take a minute. How can I do some breathing to slow down that heart rate and control myself so I can stay in the classroom? So I don't say F you, but please pass. So I can skip that reading for just a moment. Because we all have to do that to navigate our way through our days. We can't, I sit in meetings where sometimes I might get triggered, and I have to take that deep breath and stay in my space and place as a professional, and those are the types of skills that we want to help our students with. And fortunately, we have them for a while, so we have that luxury of shaping that behavior.
Absolutely. And I think, again, that's where, so my first year of teaching, my first year with Scott was in 6th grade. Mm-hmm. And then I found out that my second year of teaching, I was going to be teaching 7th grade. So I was pretty excited about that until I found out that I was going to get all the same kids. And I thought, oh goodness, this has not been a good year. This has been a year of a lot of conflict. And I was actually, I know I shouldn't admit this, I was looking forward to a whole new batch, a whole new crop of students. And so finding out that I was going to have those same kiddos was somewhat concerning for me that summer. The great thing, though, that happened was that our middle school that year, the professional development that we brought in was Boys Town. And I think that this was very impactful for me, professionally and personally, honestly. I had a 2-year-old at home and a newborn, so I wasn't exactly clear on how to deal with, as a parent dealing with behaviors. Also, as a teacher, obviously I was completely ill-equipped. And so we found out that we were going to be doing that Boys Town training. I was pretty excited. And it really did shape, because I got to see, even though I had the same kids my second year of teaching, it was a completely different year. And not because the kids changed, because I changed. And so let's look at some of those practical strategies that I was able to put into practice based on the training and professional development that I received from Boys Town. And the first thing was, first, to understand that there are going to be behaviors. Kids are going to exhibit irrational, impulsive behaviors. And understanding that behavior is just a communication of a need. All it is communicating some sort of a need. And that really shifted how I viewed behavior as a whole. But also understanding that if you can predict it, you can plan for it. If you can predict that there's going to be irrational, impulsive behaviors in your classroom, then what is your plan for that? And the first thing was having an alternative plan. An alternative plan is just knowing what you're going to prompt the rest of the class to do when you need to talk with an individual student that's experiencing big emotions, right? And especially middle schoolers, they experience big emotions frequently. And so having a plan for if you have to work with a student one-on-one or you need to work with a small group of students, what are you going to prompt the rest of the class to do when your attention needs to be someplace else? So that alternative plan, and you can get on the Boys Town training website. There's some great ideas there for alternative plans. I used the one that was MYOB. Mind your own business. And so very first week of my second year of teaching, I introduced our alternative plan in the classroom was mind your own business, MYOB. When I need you to do something on your own, because my attention is someplace else, it may be that I have to step out and talk to the principal, or maybe I need to go take a call from a parent, or maybe I need to work with a student or a group of students. And when that happens, I want all of you to MYOB, mind your own business, and here's some things that you can do. That really just kind of set that foundation of understanding that now you know exactly what to do. And again, it's one of those things that once you've taught it, 90% of your kids are going to fall right in line. They just need that little bit of a prompt and they know what to do. The second thing was having a stay calm plan. I think sometimes we think, well, the stay calm plan needs to be for kids. And you're right, the stay calm plan does need to be for kids, but the stay calm plan first needs to be for us. Because if we can't stay calm, if we don't have our own plan to stay calm, we can't teach kids how to stay calm. So it starts with us having our own stay calm plan. And so for me, kind of going through that process of understanding, we all have an early warning system. So that early warning system is that biological response. Really, it's that biological response to that cortisol. You start to feel that stress. And so what is your early warning system? For me, it is I clench my fists, I clench my jaw, my shoulders become earrings, all my tension goes up. And so when I start to feel my shoulders become earrings, I start to clench, I respond by putting my hands to my sides and touching each tip of my finger to the tip of my thumb. It requires me to stay in a rational brain. It requires me to release that energy, to kind of release some of that energy, to move that energy from where I want it to go in stress, which is up and tight, to down and loose. Helps me to stay in a teaching brain, because as I am doing that, I can stay in my teaching brain instead of going cortisol to cortisol with kids. Like I said before, cortisol is contagious. Crisis is contagious, but so is calm. So the more that I can stay in that calm brain, but in order to do that, we have to have a plan. So I think those are the first two strategies that really helped to transform my response to behavior, and especially in those difficult and challenging times. So first, have your alternative plan something that you can teach to kids, and then have your own stay calm plan. And I think then teach a plan. And I really do believe firmly that all of us are responsible for teaching some sort of a stay calm plan in our classroom. We go back to multi-tiered systems, or if we're looking at PBIS and we're looking at universal. Universal needs to be universal, which means everyone is going to receive that dosage. Every single student, we need to ensure that everyone is receiving that dosage at the universal level, which means we are all responsible for teaching some sort of a stay calm plan in our classroom. So what is that going to be? So create some sort of a lesson that you can teach all of your kids that when you start to feel big emotions, here's some ideas of what you can do. Because then we can prompt it. We can start to prompt kids. Once we teach them a plan to stay calm, we can prompt it for them. So I think that this is kind of two-tiered. You need to be able to model how to stay calm, so you have to have your plan, but then you need to also teach them how they can stay calm and then give them the prompt in the moment. It's incredibly helpful.
And Steph, one of the things I really like about the Boys Town education model is that we teach those skills and then we have kids practice.
Yes.
So like you mentioned, I've identified my triggers and what works for me. And I've done the same as the classroom teacher. Here, when I see red and my heart's beating really fast, I need to put my hands down by my side and take a deep breath. And I think it's really nice when you teach that to students that you can teach a variety and give them the opportunity to practice it so they can then fine tune and choose the one that's best for them. And so in that heat of the moment, they practice multiple and they too can choose the one that works best for them.
Exactly. Excellent. So going back to conflict, so how did this transform my second year? And so when you look at stressful incidents, so with Scott, what I didn't know about Scott is that he had, by the time he was sitting in my 6th grade classroom, he had been removed from his home 3 times and returned with Child Protective Services. The most recent time that he had been removed from his home, his mother nearly drowned him in the toilet. So we can predict that Scott had experienced some pretty stressful events. And those stressful events started to shape his feelings about himself and his feelings about others. A lot of those irrational beliefs about I'm a failure, no one cares about me, no adults are ever going to help me, I'm never going to do anything right. So some of those feelings were occurring. And so then when I said, Scott, why don't you go ahead and pick up and read? And maybe reading is something that's uncomfortable for him, it's stressful for him, which then he immediately goes to those irrational thoughts of, well, here's just another adult who wants me to look like a failure. Here's just another adult that doesn't want to help me. Here's just another example of how I'm not good enough. And so those feelings then drove that behavior of F you. Like I said, in that moment, I was either going to reinforce those irrational beliefs of no adult cares about him, no adult wants to help him, everyone is trying to make him look like a failure, which was sending him out of the classroom because I gave up on him. Or I could change that response to something that is going to help shape him into a more positive view of himself and help him to learn an alternative behavior to that automatic response. My second year of teaching, I had the tools to be able to do that. That language no longer was a button for me. All it was a behavior that I was going to have to deal with. So in that moment, I might say, you know what, Scott, looks to me like you need a pass right now. Why don't you go ahead and take a couple of deep breaths? We'll come back to this later. Does not mean that I'm going to ignore that behavior. What it does mean, though, is that I'm going to give him some time for that cortisol to drop a little bit. So then later I can go back and have a conversation with him about school appropriate behavior or school appropriate language. It's the timing, but it's also allowing the child time to get to that place where they can have a conversation, but also giving me a minute to be able to respond rather than to constantly react. So it really did change how I was able to have those conversations and build relationships. And it really was one of the most rewarding years of teaching because it really shaped the trajectory for me moving forward professionally and working with kids and really just dealing with behaviors.
So what are your next steps? Where can you start? I think we've shared a couple strategies that I think anybody can just get started with creating that alternative plan in your classroom, starting to create that safe and predictable environment. Having that alternative plan gives kids something to do when there's nothing to do. And so coming up, Steph mentioned she used the mind your own business. I used yo-yo, you're on your own. And giving kids that was really clear expectations. When I say you're on your own, that just simply means that you need to take your seat, work quietly until the next instruction is given. So they know where to go and what to do and for how long. And it's something that you can just practice at a neutral time so that when you talk about or prompt that mind your own business, prompt that yo-yo. Kids know exactly what I'm supposed to do. I need to quit doing what I'm doing now, go take my seat and work on something quietly. And then coming up with that stay calm plan for yourself. That's going to give you huge mileage. You can stay in charge of you. You can model that for your students. It allows you the opportunity to treat all kids with dignity, regardless of the behaviors that they throw at you, because sometimes those can get really big and bold. And so if you can give your kids something to do and stay in charge of you, that's really half of your battle. And then teaching them a variety of stay calm plans, things they can do to stay in charge of themselves. And how empowering for kids who have felt like they don't have control over things, to actually have a tool now that they can use, or several tools that they can use to control themselves and to navigate their way successfully. At the end of the day, we want kids to stay engaged in their academics and to reach their full potential. And part of that is addressing those social emotional needs, allowing them to learn the skills that they can work through trauma or anything that has come their way. And so in addition to those skills, you can also teach other skills, just for advocating for themselves and disagreeing appropriately and expressing feelings and asking for things to get their needs met, so that now they've got the basics of staying calm, but now they can actually start to communicate with words and using some skills to get their needs met and to advocate for the things that they need to be successful. As Steph mentioned, going to our website at boystowntraining.org has a lot of free resources, webinars to view, lesson plans, skill posters, things that you can start to use in your classroom and help to align those initiatives that you have and have that portion control that Steph mentioned at the beginning, so that you can have a well-rounded classroom, a well-balanced plate, if you will, and give kids the skills they need both academically and socially to deal with the experiences that they have had.
Yeah, and I think that really is the key to empowering those that really have the most power, which are our classroom teachers. They have the most time with students to be able to model and to teach these behaviors alongside the academics. And when you're able to view it through this lens, like you said, it makes it much more manageable. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really do hope that you have some takeaways that are practical, enabling you to manage some of those big behaviors that you're dealing with, and moving from the philosophy to some practical strategies.